In this episode of Unpacking Possibility, we'll talk about, quote, secrets of psychology that can help you feel, do, and live better and better navigate difficult situations, difficult conversations, and difficult people. So if that sounds interesting to you, stay tuned. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Unpacking Possibility. I'm your host, Traci Stein. As always, I'm so happy to be here with you. In every episode, I try to offer either information from a guest or share things that I know that I believe truly can help us all live better by feeling better, by doing better in a variety of different situations and contexts. And this episode is no different. I'm going to share, as I mentioned in the intro, quote, secrets that can help all of us to navigate difficult situations and feelings and people that much better. I'm saying it's a secret, not because anybody is trying to keep it from you. I don't think that any of that is true. I'm certainly not. But it's more that a lot of times it's things that we might not instinctively know. Or it might be that it's something you have yet to think about in this way, but doing so can help you to diffuse difficult situations. And honestly, there's no one on earth who has never had a difficult interaction with someone. I've said this before too. I think the majority of people are fairly decent to wonderful. And that we all have our days when we're less wonderful than others and so forth. But there is a subset of people, and I don't think it would make me a better person to pretend that there isn't. But there's a subset of people who are just difficult. They're difficult more often than not. Some of these people are horrendous to deal with. Some of these people are just unpleasant to deal with. But even the nicest people and the people you love can you can have difficult interactions. They can have times when they're difficult. You can have times when you're difficult. How we navigate those situations and those relationships, though, can make a huge difference in how we feel and how things go. And we're in an era, too, where it's important to know that, not everybody's equally safe to be around. And I don't think this is too negative a thing to say on a podcast that is designed to be helpful to you, because it's the truth. All you have to do is open up Twitter on your phone or sample some of the news, whatever news you're watching, and see that we're living at a time where interactions can go south very fast, and sometimes that can be very dangerous. There's no perfect solution for everything, but there is a way to navigate our dealings with difficult people, and again, the situations that really have the potential to go upside down quickly. And I believe that everything I'm going to say is also in line with the other things that you've heard about here from my guests, from me, including about trusting our intuition. Because if we give ourselves permission to see people as they are and situations as they are and work with that, then we don't have as much mental noise crowding out our intuitions about, again, those very same people and situations. So without further ado, let me talk a little bit about what we'll cover today. So some of the strategies I'll talk about, the first one, and they might not be in this exact order, but is the idea of boxing versus Tai Chi, and why Tai Chi, metaphorically, in your interactions with difficult people, can be a much better option than boxing and coming on really strong. We'll also talk related to that about the idea of being effective versus being right. Now, that comes from dialectical behavior therapy, which was created by Marsha Linehan. It's a really important clinical tool, but one of the many great things about dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, is that the skills taught there are ones every one of us could benefit from knowing about and employing in the service of living better. And so the idea of how we normally cling to being right in tense conversations rather than focusing on being effective, Once you know about that, you can choose to be more effective and let your ego let go a little bit of having to have somebody else acknowledge that you are right. So we'll talk more about that in a bit. We'll talk about something called DARVO. It's an acronym, and you may have heard more about it lately. People are talking about it on social media, but it's an acronym that stands for deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. And it's a technique that a lot of not great people, unfortunately, people who tend to gaslight you, very narcissistic people, people who aren't at all concerned about how you're doing or what's actually right. They're worried about what works for them. They might even honestly be kind of thrilled to take you down and deny your reality. It's a well-known technique of people who gaslight a lot. So we'll talk about what that is and what you can do. One of the other things we'll talk about is why you shouldn't expect more from people than is reasonable to expect given who they are and where they are in their journey. I'll go into that more in a bit. We'll talk about why you should not judge a book by its cover, especially in this era when a lot of people who appear one way are being found out to be very different. And again, trying to be a nice person and pretend that everybody is equally great is not going to help you. And in fact, it might put you in a position that is less safe for you. We'll talk about how opposites can exist in the same person. And again, I'll use some examples of like previous public figures, not even current ones, but I want you to pay attention as you see what's going on in the news and as you talk to people you know. Pay attention to how your old logic might have said, well, if they're like this in this situation, they must be like that in every situation. And so we decide that they can't possibly be a good person in public and a not great person when the cameras are off. And I'll tell you how that is not the case and why it's important for you to know. I think that's probably it. Something else might come up in the course of this episode, who knows, or maybe I'll make a part 2. But without further ado, let's talk about it. So boxing versus Tai Chi is something that I've told my patients about for years and years and years. It kind of just occurred to me one day. And, I tend to think in metaphors, and that actually is something that works out pretty well given that I do hypnosis, because your subconscious, honestly, can probably remember things better sometimes when they're framed metaphorically. I mean, that's certainly the case for me. But if you think about relationships or interactions, right? It might be a relationship with somebody at the grocery store, I don't know, which is just for that time you're there. But when we feel strongly about something, if we're really amped up, if we're angry about something or the other person is, a lot of times what happens in interactions generally, including with people we love and might normally have a great relationship with, but the more hot under the collar we get, or the more frustrated we get, or the more we hold on to the idea of us being right and other people have to acknowledge it, which is the other thing I mentioned before, what happens is we tend to engage in social interactions more like boxers. And this is what I mean. Whether it's you or the other person, somebody's getting more insistent, they're getting louder, they're sticking to their point, but to the point that you feel like you're being bludgeoned with the point they're trying to make. And listen, we've all been guilty of doing that to somebody too. Like, you're wrong and this is why, and you need to acknowledge it. But what happens, I want you to think about this. You're talking to somebody, you're standing in front of somebody, and if they threw a literal punch at you, what would you do? You only have a few options. You probably are already thinking of what your natural response would be. So for a lot of people, they would, somebody throws a punch at them, literally, they throw a punch back. You're throwing a punch back. They're coming at you, they're aggressive, they're loud, they're insistent, they're name calling. Now you're loud and aggressive and name calling too. And if you're watching the video on YouTube, first of all, please click like and subscribe and leave me a comment. But you'll see me kind of throwing my not that skillful punch at the screen to illustrate the point. But you get what I mean. So somebody throws a punch at you, or you throw a punch at them, the natural reaction for a lot of people will be to punch back. Now, the other natural reaction for people is to what? It's to run away. It's to get out of the way. It's to retreat or flee. And what happens in a conversation or when you're trying to get a point across or work something out with somebody is, part of the way they flee might be that they just shut down emotionally or they stop talking, or they're like, I don't even know if I want to have this relationship with you, if it's somebody you're in a relationship with. Or or they just shut down and pretend to agree and be like, yeah, sure, okay, whatever you want. But there isn't really agreement, it's disengagement. Now, the third thing that sometimes happens, and this is especially common in people who've had a trauma history where there was no room for dissent, is they might freeze because it's so overwhelming when somebody gets aggressive. And, a lot more people than may realize this are pretty intuitive. People especially high in empathy who can feel empathy, like stand in the place of someone else, feel as they are feeling when they, whether it's in somebody they know or somebody they read about, they feel things deeply. They may also be intuitively high empathy people. And it's overwhelming to be around someone who is yelling. It is overwhelming to be around someone who is, physically gets too close or gets threatening or starts name calling. And so their response can be to freeze. So it's like, and you've probably seen this or experienced this maybe, where it's just like a shutdown where you're not even hearing anything anymore because you're like literally dissociating from the experience. But all this is to say that the boxing technique, generally, for any relationship that you want there to be some agreement on or some positive movement or some just some meeting in the middle, boxing can shut that down. It either creates a huge fight where nobody's hearing anybody and everybody's yelling, or it creates a situation where one person pretends to agree but doesn't, or disengages, or wants to leave the relationship, or just feels unheard and unimportant. But you get what I'm saying. Now, Tai Chi, I think most people know what Tai Chi is, but if not, you should Google it and look for a video or at least a photo. Because Tai Chi is a martial art, but it's a martial art that just looks like beautiful, flowing movement. It's graceful. I remember when I used to work up at the hospital years ago, there were a few people who would, on their lunch hour, go in the courtyard and do Tai Chi on their lunch hour for like a half hour. And it is absolutely beautiful to watch. Just smooth, slow, flowing, graceful movements. I'm not doing it justice, but hopefully I'm giving you enough to kind of imagine what I'm talking about. But Tai Chi is deceptively graceful because with Tai Chi, you are possibly moving towards someone and bringing them with you. So if you're watching on video on YouTube, you can see what I'm doing, but moving towards and bringing the other person with you, but in a way that feels gentle and like you are working together. They're coming along with you. Tai Chi is something that I use as the metaphor for this because it's like if you meet somebody where they are, it is much easier to bring their energy along with you. It is much easier for them to let their own defenses go to the side for a moment to hear you. Right? Because they don't feel aggressed upon. They don't feel like you're trying to dominate them or devalue them. They don't feel shut down by your anger, or they don't feel consumed by their own anger or their own defensiveness, right? So Tai Chi does balance one's own energy, but again, as a martial art, it is about affecting the energy of the other person and deceptively, simply, and gently bringing that energy, like changing the direction of it. So Tai Chi versus boxing, try it. Next time you're really frustrated with somebody and you notice your desire to kind of force them to agree with you or come along or do things your way. And parents often get caught up in this, but partners do too, friends do, even employees and employers do. Notice the difference in how it goes and let me know. Leave me a comment on social media and let me know what happened. So, related to boxing versus Tai Chi is the idea of being right versus being effective. And I've mentioned this. Marsha Linehan, very well known, excellent clinician and researcher, developed dialectical behavior therapy. Some of you may have heard of it as DBT. DBT it's a great therapy for a number of reasons, but among them is that it talks about inner kind of balance and equanimity through meditation. Super important because, again, when we're super amped up, it's very hard to act in our own best interests and to be more effective. But the skills that are taught, a lot of them are about how we can interact with others in a more effective way. Now, when we feel very amped up emotionally and when we feel attached to being right, again, kind of related to the boxing versus Tai Chi example, we want to pound that message home. You have to agree with me, or you have to see it from my point of view. And this is going to come in handy as we talk a little bit later about DARVO, because sometimes you have to let go of harping on how right you are or insisting somebody agree with every point you've made, and think about what is the larger thing, what is the larger goal. And the larger goal is typically going to be coming to some sort of agreement, making a decision to move forward in a way that you both can be happy enough with. That's being effective, right? But when we get so focused on our ego's need to be seen and acknowledged as right, listen, I think I'm right all the time. I'm sure my husband would say he thinks he's right all the time. It's human nature, if we have a strong feeling about something, to want other people to get it. And sometimes they will, and sometimes we'll make a good case for something and somebody will be receptive enough to be like, okay, I hadn't thought about that, and vice versa. But when our egos get too involved, we tend not to communicate in a way that's as effective. So keeping in mind the ultimate goal, the compromise that you would be willing to accept, even if it is not every single thing, every single way you would ideally like it to be, it's much easier to be effective, right? Effective is getting closer to your goal without having a whole bunch of other stuff come up that you don't want, like tension in a relationship. And I highly recommend people, look that up. You can Google Marsha Linehan, Google DBT, Google the skills. It's worth doing. Okay. So we're going to come back to DARVO just because I think that's going to take a little bit longer. Here's one. But don't expect more from people than is reasonable to expect from them, given who they actually are. And I'm saying this because all of us, I know all these things you'll notice kind of relate to each other. We have somebody in our lives and we want them to be better communicators or higher functioning or not resort to the same, maybe not so healthy ways of interacting with us. And it doesn't mean that there isn't potential for growth in many relationships, but oftentimes we get attached to people being different people than they actually are. And that just causes suffering for us and a no-win situation for them. I'm going to give you an example. I've noticed this with a lot of patients who were adults and had parents who were not A-plus parents, even if they wanted to be thought of that way. And, 20, 30, 40 years later, still weren't. People who still had their own challenges, people who maybe couldn't be reliably reliable, and so forth. And there's a million ways this can be. But it could even be that somebody's dating somebody and they want them to be better at communicating like what most people would agree is a respectful way to communicate. Or, you're dating somebody and they make plans and then don't follow up, or they cancel them at the last minute all the time. And that's not okay for you. I mean, remember, in relationships, it's not only a matter of something is, empirically right or wrong. There's that. But there's also kind of our different ways of thinking things should be. If someone has shown you again and again that either they don't want to do, like overtly they're aware, I'm not doing it this way, I don't want to, something the way you feel like you need them to do it, you now have a decision to make. And some things, might be worth kind of overlooking. Somebody's kind of messier and you're really neat and you wish they were less messy or better organized. Your options really, after having gone over it again and again, are to say, this is who they are, and I wish things were different, but this probably is the most they can do or are willing to do. Or saying, this isn't enough for me and I need to move on. And I know that can be so painful. If the person is a parent, because you can leave a job, you can socialize less with a friend if it doesn't feel like the friendship's that great. But like your parents are just, that's who they are. And expecting sometimes them to be more interested in improving something about themselves than they actually are, usually is only going to lead to your frustration. And again, them feeling like you're just kind of being overly critical. So I'm sure some of you really have some thoughts in mind as I'm talking about this. I'm not being super specific because it can really vary. But, I'm going to use this example. You have a spouse and this spouse has been unfaithful and you are not okay with it. It's not an open relationship. And you've had conversations about it before. You've been in therapy, but they do it again, or they do it again and again. And there's always their reason, or they do it and they lie about it, whatever it is. What I would say is, don't expect somebody to be somebody other than they are. And again, if we go back to the episode Wise Words, and one of the quotes that I mentioned was from Maya Angelou, when people show you who they are, believe them, or believe them the first time, or decide how many chances you'll give them to be different than they're showing themselves to be. But at some point you have to say, they've shown me who they are, this is who they are. And it's up to me now to decide whether this is a deal breaker or not. And so the example I use is, when people get frustrated again and again that a loved one cannot or won't change. And sometimes it's can't. Maybe this is the best they can do because that's their level of development in this life at this age. And you have a right to maybe expect more, but they can't do it. So the example I use is, would you expect a kindergartner to do complex math problems? And listen, I know somebody out there saying, well, I'm sure there is a kindergartner out there who is a genius and can do complex math. And I'm sure you are right. But in most cases, we shouldn't expect a 5-year-old to do calculus. A lot of adults can't do that. And the point I'm making is why, what I would say is, well, why wouldn't you expect a kindergartner to be able to do calculus or some other, high-level math? And people will be like, well, duh, like a kindergartner just can't. Well, why not? Is it because they're not willing to work hard enough? No, there's no amount of studying that a 5-year-old brain can do to make it all of a sudden do these complex math problems at that age. Their brains just aren't developed enough. And so we have to adjust what our expectations are given what we now know of the person. So once we do that, it really does help us free ourselves from a lot of suffering. All right, everybody, welcome back. So today we are talking about, quote, secrets that really aren't secrets because I'm sharing them with you. Ways to better deal with difficult people and difficult situations. And again, some people are difficult 99% of the time or 100% of the time. Most people are difficult periodically in the way that they are. We all can be. And difficult people, especially the ones that are difficult, just that's who they are. You know, they can lead to a whole bunch of difficult and unpleasant situations, but we can navigate them better so we're less distressed and maintain the peace to the extent that we can. So, the next tip I wanted to talk about is don't judge a book by its cover. And the reason I'm saying this is that often we want other people to be, we want to assume that they're like us in terms that they share the same values, the same sense of ethics, they have the same internal kind of code of conduct that they follow. So for most people, I'm going to say that's probably like, in general, try not to lie. Everybody tells little fibs once in a while. Those shoes look great on you. I love your haircut. That's different. That's not what I'm saying. But some people will be better than we expect or less good than we expect. And a lot of that will depend on two things. Their attempt to present a certain way. And we'll find that with a lot of public figures. We're hearing all kinds of crazy stuff now, and more is coming out. By the time this episode comes out next week, because there's usually a bit of a delay, who the heck knows what's going to come out? But my point in saying any of this to you is that there are people who will absolutely be better even than we imagine, because I've said this before, I'll say it again, we all have our own biases. A lot of times we're biased towards people we think are, quote, like us in some way, some demographic way, whether that's they live in the same type of area, or they look like us, or they go to the same house of worship, or they voted the same way, or whatever. We tend to stay with what feels familiar, even if consciously we're thinking that's not a thing for us. And there's a lot of psychological research on why people tend to have a variety of assumptions. There's all kinds of research on implicit biases, and it's worth looking that up. But the short version of that is that it's good to ask ourselves, well, if this is my automatic reaction, why? Because the flip side of thinking other people who seem to be, quote, like us would be more trustworthy or better is that for a lot of people, and especially in a very divided world right now, we think that people who are, quote, not like us in some way, right? They look different, or they sound different, or they, worship differently, or whatever, are not okay. We may very well be treating them with less than the respect for their own innate worth and divinity, right? We may not be treating them as well as we should. Or we may be vulnerable to information that is disinformation. It's designed to make us believe it's true when in fact it is not. So here's how this is playing out, I think, in the larger world. I won't belabor this, but right now, and again, I'll just keep this to a small portion of this, but it's very relevant. The Epstein files, 3 million documents already released by the Department of Justice. It's not me making it up. It's what they've released on their website. And, this stuff has spread throughout the internet very rapidly. This stuff is incredibly disturbing. It's reported that there are 3 million more documents that have been held back. And I can't even fathom what's in them, given what I have read. And I have read a number of the documents. Like, most of it is just overwhelming to the psyche. The reason I'm bringing this up, and I'm not going to go into any detail, I've told you that before, because it's not even the point of this thing I'm trying to convey. But the point is, there are people from all walks of life across the political spectrum, in entertainment, people who are renowned for doing certain things that are very good, that have also done things that are beyond horrible. And people who are in the public eye, who have a lot of influence in the larger kind of pop culture. And I'm not just saying entertainers, and I'm not even just saying politicians, I'm saying across the spectrum. I mean, there are, renowned physicians and scientists and people in these files that it's just mind-blowing. And yet, these very same people have also made some very big public gestures that were very pro-social, that were very good. And my point is, a lot of people who are big on social media, a lot of people who have huge followings where everybody knows their name, those personas are very cultivated. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody who's famous is bad necessarily. It doesn't mean that somebody who's not famous is better. But what I'm saying is, we tend to see people and identify with them in some way as similar to us. And then there's this halo, and I've talked about that before, where we assume that the rest of them is also in line with the good things that we know. Or vice versa. We see, again, like I've said, we see somebody who is not like us and we assume that they're not good. They're not good people, right? And I think we just need to all be more thoughtful about saying, all right, how do I evaluate whether someone else is a good person? And I've said this before, I listen to my intuition. If somebody seems great and they check off 9 things out of 10, but there's something nagging at me, like just something feels off, I don't throw that out. I set that on a shelf and I wait for more data to come in. Because, our own biases have pitted us against each other, so many of us. And that's such a not okay thing. And we're seeing what happens when people think that other people, where we've demonized people who are actually good people just trying to live a life and support their families. And we have idolized people who tell you how great they are, and in fact, they are not. The other thing I want to say is opposites can exist in the same person. I'm going to give you 2 examples. Eliot Spitzer, these are from opposite ends of the spectrum too. Eliot Spitzer, if you remember back a while ago, governor of New York, Eliot Spitzer was known as a crusader against prostitution and against a whole bunch of stuff that he wound up being involved with himself. He was a complete contradiction in his private life than in his public life. In his public life, he had a lovely wife and lovely children and was kind of like a good guy kind of crusader, and had this whole other life that was completely different. I'm not going to go into too much detail. You can look him up. The other one is Tammy Faye and Jim Baker, televangelists way back in the day. Some of you are old enough to remember, talking about God and talking about morality and preaching and holding themselves up as these paragons of virtue. Not remotely true. In their private lives, they were doing, all kinds of stuff that was literally the exact opposite of all the stuff they were purporting to be in public. They preached against certain things and decided who was a sinner, and then in their private lives, they were doing those things and more. So we assume that people can't have these very significant contradictions within them. The germaphobe, who we say, well, they're a germaphobe, so they can't possibly be doing this horrific germy thing or thing that would expose them to other people when they are known as a germaphobe, doesn't mean that both of those things can't be true. I mean, generally people tend to be relatively consistent, but we shouldn't assume that one thing isn't possible because they are saying something else in public. And again, like, we want to be open to the evidence. The last thing I want to talk about really quickly, and we could talk about it more in another episode if people want to, is DARVO. I mentioned that at the beginning. DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. It is a tactic that is a favorite of narcissists, is a favorite of people who don't really have maybe the best moral compass. They don't feel bad lying. They don't feel like, I wouldn't call them people who would score high on a scale of conscientiousness. They don't care. They care about them. They care about winning. They care about imposing their will on you and not taking responsibility. So this is something that if you Google, you'll see a lot about DARVO in, pop culture and pop psychology. The thing with people who use this technique a lot, they can be from all walks of life. They can be people who are really skilled at doing it, because what happens is they're used to figuring out, they're so uncannily good at finding who will be vulnerable to that technique. People who really want to be liked. If somebody's getting angry and self-righteous at you, even though they wronged you, you can start to doubt your own sanity. You can start to doubt, like, maybe you brought something to somebody's attention. Hey, it wasn't right that you did this thing. And they're turning it into you being the terrible person, and they're the victim, and they will literally take the truth and turn it into a pretzel. If you've had this happen to you, because you leave feeling overwhelmed and slightly like you're holding crazy. So I want to tell you what you can do if somebody is trying to gaslight you and make you deny reality that is true. So if somebody is trying to lie to you, manipulate you, turn things around so that they're the victim, even though they did this thing. And, sometimes, again, I use the example of a cheating spouse, the cheating spouse who will tell you that you're crazy for thinking they're cheating. Meanwhile, like, it's patently, like, there's objective evidence to that effect. Or you find out that that's happened and now they're blaming you. Like, if you weren't this way, they would never have been forced to cheat on you, and therefore it's your fault. DARVO. So when you're dealing with somebody like that, it's really important to remember that you are not going to take a person who's has no problem lying and manipulating, and you're not going to make them a better person. You're not going to make them care. You're not going to make them conscientious. You're not going to make them see your point of view. They're not going to make them feel bad about doing this, whatever thing they did. So again, it's kind of like with being right versus being effective. It's sticking to the thing that is most important for you to get out or establish in that conversation, understanding that the rest they're not gonna own. So be brief, calm, and factual in your dealings with people like that. Stick to the main point. You get to decide what it is. And they may continue to try to gaslight you, even like if the hand of God came down and said, you're wrong here, and you actually did this, they would still find a way to lie about it. Remember that you can't technically win with somebody who does that, who engages that way, because they know they're lying. It's not like they don't know that they did this thing. They don't care. And they want to make sure that they squash you. And they know that certain people, again, people who want to be liked, people who are super conscientious, it's going to be harder for you. So your job is really to just decide calmly the most important thing for you to achieve, knowing that they won't feel bad or acknowledge it. And then I would even try and ram home the idea that you know who they are. You do. If you can come to an agreement on a key thing, great. You may or may not be able to. But the more unflappable you are, the more calm you are, the better. In general, I'd say minimize your contact with people like that. I would also say engage with them only when necessary. You might have to if it's like your ex-partner and you have kids together or whatever, but don't get sucked in. And I would say get professional support if you need it. But always keep in mind that the most important thing in these situations is for you to be safe and you to limit your engagement with people who do that. And it's unfortunate because there's no great way to win. Setting clear boundaries. So if somebody's like verbally abusive and you're on the phone, I'm not going to talk with you while you're saying these things. Let's do everything over email from now on and keep a record. But, there's more we could go into on that. You let me know if you want to hear more. But as always, I hope this is helpful. I really do want to know what you think. And I wish you all the very best now and always. So until next time, again, be well.